been described as the Mozart of rock and roll, someone who was able to put his musical finger on the innocence of youth with a musical maturity far beyond his years. George Martin said that nobody ever made a bigger impression on the Beatles, and Bob Dylan suggested that he donate his ear to the Smithsonian. So we're going to check out some of the haunts, homes, and music that shaped the Beach Boys and their sometimes tortured but always innovative mastermind, Brian Wilson. So we're standing at the Redondo Beach Breakwater, and in July of 1961, Dennis Wilson, along with his first cousin Mike Love, decided to come here one morning and go fishing. And they were idly chatting while they were here about surfing. Dennis actually surfed. And he was talking about, although there were some cool instrumentals by the Ventures and Dick Dale about surfing, no one had put lyrics to any of this stuff. And that's when the first light bulb actually went on. So Dennis and Mike decided to go home and tell Brian about it. And they could have had no clue that an idea as simple as putting surf lyrics to Brian Wilson's melodies would have such an impact and change the course of music and really make this the epicenter for fun, fun, fun in the endless summer. Anyways, Redondo Beach Breakwater. In the late 50s, Hawthorne, California was a living dichotomy. Just 6 miles from the ocean, it was a gritty, working-class Los Angeles suburb where factories like Northrop Aircraft resided right next to the Mattel Corporation, where their brand new doll named Barbie was quickly becoming their bestseller. So this is what used to be the neighborhood the Wilson brothers grew up in, and their house was right here. It's long since been razed and been replaced by something as California as you can get, a freeway. So the stories I've heard, the plaque is right here, but this was actually the house that was looking at theirs. I believe their house would have been underneath where the freeway is now. But back in the day, Brian lived here with his brothers, Carl and Dennis, and his parents, Audrey and Murray. And Murray was a part-time musician and songwriter, and the house was always alive with music. But Murray Wilson could be a cruel and brutal man, and his music career never took off, and he would sometimes take his frustrations out on his sons. It's rumored that Brian's almost total loss of hearing in his right ear was a result of an injury he suffered after one of Murray's tirades. But like it or not, and for better or worse, Murray became their business manager and partner. Brian shared a bedroom here with his 2 brothers, and sometimes after lights out, they'd lay around and harmonize. The garage was eventually turned into a music room, and of course, this is where the very earliest inception of the Beach Boys happened, where they rehearsed and even did some recording, the 119th Wilson House. So we're driving around Hawthorne, and it's surprising how much has and hasn't changed in 60 plus years here. Mattel and Barbie have moved out, but SpaceX has moved in. And it's really surprising the number of hangouts that the Beach Boys used to frequent that are still here. So right along Hawthorne Boulevard here were a number of places the Beach Boys used to hang out. One of them being the Pizza Show, which is still going strong. They used to like to eat here because it stayed open late after gigs. Another favorite was the Foster Freeze right here, and this is where they heard their song Surfin' on the radio for the first time. And hearing your song on the radio for the first time is no different than being kissed for the first time. It's something you never ever forget. And then this storefront, which used to be Melody Music. And Melody Music is where the Beach Boys would have gone to buy their records and, you know, guitar strings, things like that. And as a matter of fact, Al Jardine bought his Martin acoustic guitar here, and I believe he still may have it. So this place right here is called the Crenshaw Manor, and this is where Brian moved to when he moved out from his parents' house. He couldn't have been more than like 19 or 20 years old. And as Brian said, it was $150 a month and no parents. Worth every penny. So on the way to Hollywood here, I thought we might take a little detour. We're in the area. And this house right here used to be the childhood home of Mike Love. And he lived here with his parents and siblings. and with his mother, Emily, who was Murray Wilson's younger sister. Mike Love always said he was closer to Brian than his own siblings, and they both inherited their parents' love of music. But on Christmas Eve, this is where Mike Love first started singing with the Wilson brothers, and Brian would carefully orchestrate the Christmas carols. And even at that young age, as young teenagers, Mike Love knew that Brian was somewhat of a prodigy. But anyways, right here at the Love House. In 1961, Murray Wilson used one of his contacts to get publishers Height and Dorinda Morgan to take on the band, who at the time were referring to themselves as the Pendletones. They came here to cut the master at what used to be World Pacific Studios, and by the way, it's still operational and now owned by none other than Neil Diamond. Anyways, the song they recorded was called Surfin'. It took 7 or 8 takes and a couple of arguments between producer Murray Wilson and Dennis, but they ended up with a master recording that would be picked up by independent record label Candix Records. And I only mention Candix because they were the ones that decided to change the name from the Pendletones to the Beach Boys. The band had no idea of the change until they saw the name on the actual 45s. And at the time, Mike Love was the oldest member of the band at 20, and Carl Wilson was still only 14 years old. Although Surfin' was a smash hit here in LA and made it all the way up to 75 on the national charts, the Beach Boys felt they needed a bigger label to promote them, and they landed here at Capitol. Since the Capitol Records studio is down here on the ground floor, right below the offices, it's kind of surprising that the Beach Boys didn't do more recording here. They did a lot of their early stuff here. Brian has been quoted as saying that he didn't like the vocal sound here, and they used a lot of outside studios like Western, United, Gold Star, RCA. But I think closer to the truth was that the band, and especially Brian, just didn't care for the way Capitol handled things and wanted to distance themselves and produce the records without their input. Brian felt the record company was only interested in making money, and they pushed him to write the same song over and over again. And I think the eventual stress of being a hit maker that so many people depended on led to his eventual downfall. Anyways, right here, Capitol Records. So now we're on Gardner Street in West Hollywood, and in 1965, Brian Wilson and his wife Marilyn were living in this apartment building right here. And it's where Brian dropped acid for the very first time, and there's a pretty great story that goes along with it, so let's check it out. So after holing up in his bedroom and tripping for hours, Brian came out and sat down at the piano. He had had this idea when this was going on of some kind of cowboy music. It was kind of like a Happy Trails thing, you know, dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee. And he went to work on it. So the next day, Mike Love drops by, and Brian shows him what he had come up with. And Brian started with a line he had gotten out of paging through one of his wife Marilyn's fashion magazines. Well, East Coast girls are hip, I really dig those styles they wear. And of course they were off, but thus became perhaps the greatest mythological song about California ever, California Girls, right here. So in 1965, there were literally 2 Beach Boys groups. There was the group out on the road touring, and then there was Brian Wilson doing the instrumentals here in LA with the Wrecking Crew at studios like this one. This used to be Western Studios, now it's EastWest, and let's have a look. In many ways, Brian looked at the Beach Boys touring group as just another instrument to use in the recording studio, and that's exactly what he did. He used RCA, Gold Star, Capitol, and then right here at Western, and you know, they're all within just a couple blocks of each other. And this was Brian's favorite room here. So this is the former Studio 3 tracking room. It's a lot smaller than I thought it would be, because they used to do their vocals right here, and they'd have the Wrecking Crew in here also, a lot of musicians in here. Generally speaking, the way they'd place the mics, they'd have a couple of these big guys right here with one microphone, Al Jardine, Brian, his brothers Carl and Dennis doing group vocals on there. There'd be a second mic right here for Brian to do lead vocals on when he did it. He'd jump from microphone to microphone. And then over here facing them would be Mike Love on his own dedicated microphone. Generally speaking, when he sang lead, he would do that. And he also did a lot of bass parts too, so they wanted him on his own separate mic. And then you have the piano right here, which they would gather around to learn the songs with Brian. And by the way, I think one of the areas that Brian Wilson excelled at was in double tracking vocals. A lot of people did it, but the Beach Boys were so tight that theirs had kind of a shine and shimmer that no one else came close to having. So Brian was in total control in the studio, but the one person whose counsel he would seek out was his youngest brother, Carl. And I think Carl Wilson was the great unsung hero of the Beach Boys, because when they were out on the road, he was basically musically in charge. And his mother, Audrey Wilson, used to mention that Carl was born 30 years old. So anyways, this is a console here, which is a Trident A range. Now, this is not the same board that they used to have here. Brian had the ability to hear complex orchestrations in his head. And I think he was very single-minded about things, and sometimes that single-mindedness would drive others to distraction. And, you know, a lot of people have called him a genius, but he never saw himself that way. He saw himself as a really hard-working guy. But I think that kind of hard work never came more to the fore than it did with what I feel is his masterpiece, or the Beach Boys' masterpiece, Good Vibrations. At a cost of over 50 grand, it took 6 months and 10 different studios to record. And mind you, Brian took the sound with everybody, the record company, his father Murray, and the band on his back about finishing it. But I think the results speak for themselves. So, the former Western Studios, now EastWest Studios, right here. So by 1966, Brian was living in this Beverly Hills neighborhood. We're in the hills above Coldwater Canyon. And this is where he wrote much of Pet Sounds with a lyricist and ex-jingle writer named Tony Asher. And Tony said that the sessions would generally start in the morning, but nothing much got done till later afternoon. And often these sessions would last into the wee hours. Asher also mentioned that it wasn't uncommon to see royalty checks for tens of thousands of dollars laying around on counters and tables. When asked about his opinion of Brian, he said that he was completely irresponsible to everything but the music, and that he was a genius as a musician, but an amateur as a human being. And later in his career, Tony Asher wrote songs for the Partridge Family, and one has to wonder what he thought about those guys. Anyways, the Pet Sounds house right here. So as we travel west on Sunset Boulevard towards the ocean, we come to what has to be the toniest enclave of Los Angeles, Bel Air. This is where Brian Wilson's house was in the later 60s and 70s, and it's where his first full home recording studio was located. Brian and the group recorded 6 albums here, including Wild Honey and Sunflower, and it's also where Charles Manson recorded some very provocative demos with Dennis Wilson, but more on that later. The studio remained here until 1972 when it was dismantled and moved to their new state-of-the-art Brothers studio in Santa Monica. So in the spring of 1968, Dennis Wilson was driving in Malibu, and he picked up a couple girls that were hitchhiking, and he brought them home to his pad right here on Sunset Boulevard. A couple hours later, he left for a recording session, and when he got back, he was greeted by none other than Charles Manson and several other girls. So to say the least, Dennis was very taken aback, and he straight up asked Manson, "Are you here to hurt me?" And Manson said, "Does it look like I'm here to hurt you?" And he got down on his knees and he kissed Dennis's feet. Anyways, let's go around back here. I want to check it out. So one thing led to another, and Manson totally glommed onto Dennis. And Dennis started introducing him around to some of his Hollywood types, one being Terry Melcher, the producer. And at the time, Terry Melcher was living with Candace Bergen in a house in Benedict Canyon that was later the location of the Sharon Tate murders. So Charles Manson had co-wrote a song with Dennis called Cease to Exist. And Dennis claims that Manson sold all his rights to the song for some cash and a motorcycle. So by the way, this is the back of the property right here. Actually, the Tom Petty property that he used to own in the 80s called the Chicken Shack is right here. And the Dennis Wilson house is right there. But anyways, the Beach Boys reworked the song and they renamed it Never Learn Not to Love. And they actually performed it for a live audience on the Mike Douglas Show, national TV. And Charles Manson was really pissed at him because they had changed the lyrics. And he made a promise not to do that. And he was so pissed, as a matter of fact, that he threatened to murder Dennis Wilson. And you know, when Charles Manson's threatening you with murder, it tends to make you just a little nervous. So before the actual Manson murder trials, it's rumored that Dennis Wilson used to get phone calls saying, "You're next," before they'd hang up. And he would also wake up and find that someone had rearranged his furniture, as if to say, "We were here while you were sleeping." Dennis ultimately refused to testify against Manson, but after being privately interviewed by prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi, testimony was given by someone in the trial who corroborated Dennis' story, so it became a moot point. Anyways, pretty heavy stuff for a rock and roll drummer. And by the way, this is Shay J, and this was one of Dennis's favorite hangouts. And in honor of him, I could use a beer right now, so. So now we find ourselves in a very guarded part of Malibu, and this is where Brian Wilson's beachfront home in the 80s and 90s, during the most tumultuous time of his career, were. And it's funny because the surfers are all right here. The waves happen to be breaking right in front of the house, which is right there. Brian once said, no matter how bad things get, there's always something to eat. And at the time, he was drug-addled, depressed, and weighed over 300 pounds. And this is when Dr. Eugene Landy came back on the scene for the second time. And he spent the next 9 years right here treating Brian. You know, Landy was famous for his Svengali-like methods. He exerted total control over everything Brian did, down to interviewing relatives and friends before they were allowed to see him. His methods involved copious amounts of antipsychotic pills and meddling in Brian's career, including taking 25% of the copyrights that Brian generated while under Landy's care. And to say the least, getting rid of Landy was messy and expensive. And if you want the Cliff Notes version of it, there was a movie called Love and Mercy starring Paul Giamatti as Eugene Landy. And I think that does a pretty good job of describing it. But anyways, right here, Malibu Beach, the Brian Wilson Beach Estate. You know, it's virtually impossible to talk about the Beach Boys without conjuring up images of an endless summer, California girls, the beach. And I guess if you're going to be trapped by your image, it's a pretty good thing to be trapped by. Since the late 90s, the rejuvenated Brian has toured fairly consistently as a solo act. And although Carl and Dennis are gone, Mike Love, Al Jardine, Bruce Johnson, and even David Marks still remain active, and the Beach Boys remain more beloved than ever. So I'd like to thank Brian and all the Beach Boys for keeping the California dream alive during the very cold winters of my Midwestern youth. And for Tim, thank you so much for hanging out with us. Keep playing it loud. Peace out to you. Bye-bye.